Hi and welcome back to another video. This is the Programming Duck channel. My name is Spiros and this video is naming in code, the ultimate guide and reference. Okay, so we'll be going deep into naming. We'll cover a lot of things so that you can write great names in your code moving forward. Names that a programmer that comes and reads them tomorrow, they can understand what the code is doing and they can work with it easily. So this video is going to be broken up into three sections. Section 1 is the motivation. Why do we want good names? What do names help us with and how? Section 2 is naming conventions that apply to pretty much anything in code. General things that you always need to bear in mind when naming. And section 3 is on how to name specific things such as variables, functions, classes. So let's get started. So why do we want good names? Well, it comes from clean code and programming principles, which tell us that we want code that is as easy as possible to work with, to change, all those good things. And names help us in a few ways. So first of all, names help us understand code faster. And this means that we can work quicker, okay? Because we spend less time reading old code trying to understand it and more time writing new code. Names also help us understand code, like period, in comparison to not being able to understand it. Because if we don't understand or if we misunderstand how some code works, then we can easily create bugs. You know, if we have the wrong idea of what something does and then we work on it, that's just really bad for our code base. And finally, good names also mean that we don't need to change code as much in the future. So we'll see these in more detail later. To start with, how good names make code faster to understand. Well, you know, if you consider that you have a function named print hello to the screen, you know what the function does right away. You're not thinking, I don't know what that does, let me read the function body so that I have a good idea of what it actually does and how I can use it. A good name instantly tells you what something does, which saves you time. The second thing is that good names make code easier to understand. Okay, and how they do that is if you look at the slides, look at the function foo we have there. What the heck does that do, right? Like no one has any idea what that does. Even the person that wrote this function 6 months from now doesn't know what it does, as simple as that. Instead, if we give everything a good name, like in this version that you can see on the screen, right? Now what it does and why it does it is immediately clear, all right? So one of the important things to understand is that it's not enough for you to be able to read what the code does. You need to understand like what it does conceptually. Okay, it's not enough for you to read like this code removes the initial white space from the string and then it sends some network request. Like, no, you need to understand this code formats the username and sends a password reset request, right? You must understand what the code does conceptually, otherwise you can't really work with it. Okay, so that's how names help. Let's move on to general naming tips for all code. All right, so what is a good name? In short, a good name is anything that you read and you immediately understand what it does or what it is or something like that without needing to think about it. In comparison, a bad name is one that you read and you're like, what's that? Or what does that do? If you don't immediately understand, if you need to think about it, then the name should have been more descriptive, so you didn't need to do that. All right, so here are some pointers to accomplish that. The first pointer is to have clear naming conventions. All right, we've seen from clean code and programming principles that conventions help with everything. A convention means that, well, one, you save time because you don't need to think, how do I do X? The convention tells you how to do it. Two, the new programmer that you hire tomorrow, if you're using a convention that they know, it makes work for them so much faster, okay? This applies in naming. If you have a good naming convention, you immediately understand, okay, that thing has this prefix, I know what it is, and when you need to come up with a name for something, the naming convention may already tell you what to do, so that makes you faster. And as we briefly mentioned already, if you don't follow a naming convention, then someone may misunderstand the code. Someone may think that you're following this convention, but you're not. So they assume you do. They have the wrong idea of how the code works, and now they're going to create bugs. So ideally, follow the existing conventions in your programming language or your framework. And failing that, if for whatever reason you don't want to do that, then you can create naming conventions that exist in your own project as well. And just for some examples of naming conventions, for example, you can have the Airbnb JavaScript style guide or the .NET naming guidelines, and there are many more, of course. All right, the next point is to prefer descriptive names. Okay, so in general, you need to think, will the next person that reads this name understand what it is or what it does? Okay, so in general, you want to use full words, like for example, calculate area instead of calc area, and create window instead of see win. Okay, like what the heck is see win? You need to think, will the next person understand this? And full words are easier to understand. Okay, now in particular, you want to avoid very short variable names, like for example, D and E. Okay, because if you have a variable named D, well, what the heck does that mean? It could be the document, the date, data, days. You just don't know. It's not descriptive enough. Okay, and if you really want to use a short variable name here and there, there is one exception. It is when it's used in a function that's very small. Okay, so if you read the variable E, for example, it's easy for you to look 1 or 2 lines up and see what it does. So in a small scope, as it's called, you can use a short variable name. Even in cases like that, I would use a full name. Like instead of using E, I would use event. Saving a few keystrokes isn't as important as having a good readable name. And of course, convention also comes first usually. So what that means is that you can use the names I and J in for loops and things like that, because everyone in the world understands those, and it might even be weird if you don't use those, right? Because that's what they're used to. Another thing to consider is acronyms, right? Like for example, HTML, HTTP, things that are phrases or full words abbreviated into letters, right? Now with acronyms, if the next person is going to understand the acronym, in other words, if the acronym is super common, then feel free to use the acronym. If you're in doubt whether it's a common enough acronym or not, then don't use it, right? Use the expanded version. All right, having said that, yes, descriptive names are good, but you don't want names that are 3,000 words long and difficult to work with, because it's just useless. It's unnecessary, it doesn't add information, they're more difficult to type, and all those good things. So conciseness matters. In general, if you have a short name that has the same clarity as a longer name, then of course prefer the short one. Okay, the next point is to consider the context. And what this means is that, like, sometimes the surrounding code can give you useful information for what's going on, which means that you can sometimes get away with shorter names. For example, if you have a class named users, okay, if you want a method to create a new user, you can just call that method create, because the usage of that method would be something like users.create. And that is sufficiently descriptive, right? Because the context, the class users, gives you additional information. So in this case, you don't need to call the method create user, because it would be redundant, right? I hope that makes sense. And the next thing is just a quick note about casing, because there are some cases, pun not intended, where you do different things under different situations. So just to get it out of the way, I'm sure you already know about casing. You have snake case, which is like everything is lowercase and the words are separated with underscores. You have Pascal case, where the words aren't separated with anything, but every new word starts with a capital letter, right? So you can see an example on the slides. And then you have camel case, where it's the same as Pascal case, except that the first word begins with a lowercase letter. Now, like an edge case to this is, what do you do with acronyms? Okay, because acronyms are like a different word per letter, right? So you can either capitalize everything, right? For example, if you have the variable name HTML tag, okay, the HTML, the acronym, you can either fully capitalize it, and that, by the way, is what they do in front end. Some examples of that are the names XML document, HTML collection, DOM string, performance.toJSON, right? All the acronyms are fully capitalized there. But a convention they have in .NET that I think is quite nice is, if an acronym is 3 letters or longer, okay? So for example, HTML is 4 letters, right? Then in that case, only capitalize the first letter if you need to, right? So for example, with HTML tag, if you used camel case, HTML would be lowercase. And if you used Pascal case, the H in HTML would be uppercase, and then the TML would be lowercase, okay? And for acronyms that are 2 letters long, then you either capitalize both of them or you keep both of them in the lowercase, okay? So for, if it's Pascal case, like the variable name IO stream, if using Pascal case, you would capitalize the IO, and if using camel case, you would have the IO lowercase. So I personally really like that, but of course, if you are doing front end, then follow the front end convention, and if you're not doing front end, then this seems like a nicer convention to me. All right, the next point is a little bit subtle to understand, and if it doesn't fully make sense, that's fine. Feel free to skip this section. But it is to use semantic naming where you can. And semantic naming, what it means basically is to name something after its purpose or after what it does first, and then if that's not possible, to name it after how it does it, okay? And another bonus to this is that it makes code more resistant to change tomorrow. It means that if you change code, you'll have to make less changes, and this is always a really good thing. So another way of thinking about it, though, is the next person that reads this code, what is the most important thing that they want to know about it, okay? So I think the best way to go through this is to give a couple of examples. So here is an example of a variable name. Imagine that we have a collection of users, okay? Say like a list, an array, whatever it is, of users, okay? The important part about that is that it holds users, okay? It's not that the users are in a list or an array or a map or anything, right? It's that it holds users. That's what the next person would want to know. Not only that, but like your code editor would tell you this is an array, it has these methods, okay? So like you really don't need that information. So the name users would be what I would personally go with. Another name that someone else may go for would be the name user list. Okay, like if it's a list data structure, they might name it that. Now that's fine, but again, the downsides are that the list, the part about it being a list, is less important than the part about it holding users. And also, if you change the data structure tomorrow, you'll have to update the name, right? If you're not using a list tomorrow, but you're using a map instead, the name won't make sense anymore. So you have to update the name as well. And another choice for the variable name would be something like user collection, okay? Now, that's a little bit better than user list in my opinion, because if you change the data structure tomorrow, you don't need to update the name. The collection part still makes sense. But as we already said, the name users already implies that it's a collection. So like it's a little bit redundant. So that's why I think users would be the best name. As another example, you have interfaces and their class implementations, right? So for example, you might have an interface named sorter for a sorting algorithm. And at the interface level, that makes sense because a user that's using that interface, that's what they would want to know. They would want to know that this is a sorter. It sorts stuff. And at the class implementation level, the thing that is important is the implementation of the sorting algorithm, right? Like, for example, you might have classes like bubble sort, merge sort, or quick sort, or something like that. That's the important bit, because the user would want to know what algorithm they're using, and also the algorithm name is what separates each class from one another. All right, one that might be a little bit more subtle is, imagine you have a class, and like, say again, a class that's like a collection of users, and you want to sort the users in there, say alphabetically, okay? So the natural instinct would be to have a method named sort, and that would be good. But if you only had like that one sorting method in there, you wouldn't want to name it quick sort or merge sort. You would just want it to be called sort. And that's for a few reasons, right? Because first of all, the user that's going to use that method, they probably don't care what algorithm it's using internally, right? Like, I know certainly when I use JavaScript, I just use the sort function. I don't care what it does internally. And the other reason is because you might change the algorithm tomorrow, okay? Like, maybe you're using bubble sort today, obviously not, but let's pretend, and you want to use merge sort tomorrow, or maybe quick sort. And if your public method is named quick sort, how are you going to do that? You're going to change it to merge sort. You'll also need to change the name of the public method. Otherwise, it won't make sense. And that's a really big change to change the public method of something. But of course, if you just called it sort, then you don't need to change anything else. You can just change the implementation and you're fine. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the general tips for naming. But before we move on, just a few tips from Uncle Bob and also from the .NET naming conventions. So in Uncle Bob's book, Clean Code, he recommends the following things for naming. 1, to make meaningful distinctions. So for example, if you have some variables like account info and account data, like, someone can't tell the difference with what those variables are, right? You need to have names that someone can understand, and especially that are distinctive enough from one another. The next point is to use pronounceable names, okay? Like, don't use whatever that variable would be pronounced like. Use something like generation timestamp or modification timestamp instead, okay? Something that you can pronounce easily. Another one is to use names that you can search for easily in your code editor and things like that. So particularly, you want to avoid single variable names, as we already said, because if you try and search that throughout your code, you're going to get 100 matches and you're not going to be able to find your variable, okay? Another point is to try to avoid using cute words or offensive words. I know sometimes it feels like you need to use those, right? But try to avoid it, try to be professional and stuff. Don't use the word whack or see you later files for a method, right? Use something appropriate. And another is to pick one word per concept. Okay, so what that means is that between the choices for fetch, get, retrieve, pick one and use it for all of those operations. Okay, so don't use all three, pick one word for that concept and use it consistently throughout your code. And a point kind of similar to that is to don't use the same word for different concepts. Okay, so for example, if you have a class that has a method add, where it adds two numbers, don't also use the word add for like adding a new item to a list. Add should add the two numbers and then use a different word for adding another item to the list. Don't use the same word for two different things. And from the .NET naming conventions, now these are some tips that are mostly applicable to something like .NET, where you can use different languages, sort of, switch one out for the other, so to speak, and they talk together very easily and stuff like that, okay? So it may not apply to the code you write, maybe, depending on what you do, but you can keep it in mind anyway if you want to. So those are Avoid names that conflict with common keywords in other programming languages. Prefer semantic names rather than language-specific names. For example, have a method called getLength instead of getInt. And prefer generic type names instead of language-specific type names. So for example, the .NET guidelines give the example of use the name toInt64 instead of toLong, because the type long is only present in a couple of the .NET languages, whereas the type toInt64 is present in the CLR, if that makes sense. So it's it makes sense for all languages, but the name toLong doesn't make sense for all languages, something like that. And as another one, it says to prefer naturally readable names. For example, name a variable horizontal alignment and not alignment horizontal, which isn't how you would normally pronounce those words, okay? All right, yeah, so that was quite a lot so far. But next, let's move on to how to name specific things like functions, variables, classes, those kinds of things, okay? So firstly, variables. So basically variables denote things. They're things and labels for data and objects and stuff. And some conventions for variables are that they should be nouns. They should be things. For example, car, user, student, player, result, area, things like that. And in most programming languages, they're either written as camel case or snake case. Now, when it comes to constants, some programming languages write them fully uppercased with snake case, with underscores rather, to separate the words. Some examples are, number of lives, where you have number underscore of underscore lives, and things like that, okay? Now, be careful with constants, because constant doesn't mean just any immutable variable. It means something that's a special value that doesn't depend on runtime, okay? You could take it out of your code and you could put it in some configuration file and your code would still work. So constants doesn't mean any variable that just happens to be immutable. It means any variable that you can take out and put in configuration instead, okay? And finally, for variables that have Boolean values, you generally name them with a predicate. And what that means is you kind of phrase them as a question. And some examples of that are things like is valid, is complete, has run, has arrived, has the sentence, can take damage, things like that, okay? Like question-like variables. You might be thinking, do I really need to do that? Can't I just name a variable something like complete, right? So instead of is complete, you might say complete instead, name your variable that. There are a few problems with that, and that is that the word complete can mean different things in programming, like the way that the word complete is written. First of all, it's both a verb and an adjective, okay? So it could be a function that you run to complete something, okay? It could be a variable that holds things that have already completed. It could be a Boolean, like what we're talking about right now, right? It could be an event name. It could be a lot of things, and it's not clear to the programmer that's going to read this code after you on what exactly it means, okay? And an alternative to that, you might call it completing instead. So this is a little bit better because completing is like something that's already happening. It's not something you can start doing now. So it means that it can't be a function, okay? You wouldn't call a function completing, but it could still be any of the other three things we just spoke about. So for that reason, prefer predicates because you know they denote Booleans, okay? Okay, so the next thing is functions. So in general, functions are things that do something. For that reason, they should be verbs, okay? And they usually start with a lowercase letter, and they use either camel case or snake case in most programming languages. So some examples of function names are things like create report, create to do, get X, divide, send request, things that do something. Okay, and again, just like with variables, there are a couple of variations. For functions that return Boolean values, a common convention is to start them with a predicate. Basically, they're written basically the same like variables with Booleans. So before we were saying like a name like completing can do like 3 things, well, predicates can denote Boolean variables or functions that return Booleans. It's not perfect, but it's the convention. So some example functions for that are is valid, has signed in, is signed in, can drive, things like that, okay? And another convention that I've seen is for like transformer functions or converter functions, if that makes sense, which is like functions that convert from one data type or something to another. They tend to start with the word to and then the thing they convert to. So for example, some names are to lowercase, to uppercase, to array, to string, things like that. Okay, and that brings us to classes. So classes are basically, units of code that contain like attributes and methods and things like that, okay? Classes should be nouns. They tend to use Pascal case, at least in every programming language that I've seen. So some example names for classes are things like observable, student, printer, player, image sprite, things like that, okay? And classes have properties. So in general, attributes are named similarly to variables because they are basically variables inside classes. And methods are named similarly to functions, okay? Because they're like the same thing. So that means nouns for variables, verbs for functions, for methods, and things like that, all right? And again, as we briefly mentioned before, remember that the class name may provide some context, right? So for example, if you have a class named users, you can name your method just create. The usage of it would be users.create. And that would be sufficiently descriptive, things like that. A thing that we can go more in depth into is casing for properties, because different languages have different convention basically. And also like prefixes like the underscore and things like that. So basically many programming languages have the following convention. Things like Java and Python recommend using camel case for your properties. And they also recommend using an underscore, prefixing an underscore to private properties, okay? So for example, you might have the name underscore private property, something like that, okay? Something that's different is the C# naming conventions. So in C#, you use Pascal case for your public properties, both methods and attributes, not camel case, okay? But for your private stuff, you do use camel case. And if something is like normal private, you prefix it with an underscore. And if something is a static property that's private, you prefix it with S underscore and then the name. And if something is like a thread thing, something that's going to be used in a thread, you prefix it with T underscore and then the name. Okay, so it's a little bit more complex, but I thought I'd mention it here for completion. Now, if you were going to create your own convention for whatever reason, then I personally quite like the Unity convention, the Unity game engine. So what they do is they use Pascal casing for public methods, okay? The reason I like this is because it differentiates from, like we saw before, like attributes holding booleans, they would be lowercase, and methods returning booleans, they would be uppercase, okay? So Pascal casing for public methods and camel casing for public attributes. They also use the underscore for non-public stuff, just like usual. And then from then on, if you wanted to use the S prefix or the T prefix, that's up to you. I'm not sure if I would do that, but yeah. So that's my favorite convention. If I was creating one, that's the one I would use. All right, so we're getting closer to the end here. And next we have interfaces, okay? So two quick things about interfaces. First of all, they're named similarly to classes in that they're nouns. And there's a question of, do you prefix your interface with I? For example, you might have an interface I-foo, right? Or do you not? Now, Uncle Bob, in his book Clean Code, and also the Java naming conventions, don't use the prefix, but the C# naming conventions do use the prefix. So you would use I-foo. Personally, I prefer not to use the I, the prefix, because I think about it like the user that's going to use my interface, that's going to read it in code, I think they care a lot more about what the interface is or does than the fact that it's an interface. Like the fact that it's an interface rather than a class feels like an implementation detail to me, right? It's like when we talked about semantic naming before. But, it depends on your opinion as well. So anyway, enums next. So the convention in Java is to treat enums like classes with constants, okay? So what that means is that the enum type is named like a class, and then the properties, the fields of the enum are named like constants. That's fully uppercase with underscores to separate the words. And C# does something different. Even for like proper constants, I think the convention is still to use Pascal casing. So you wouldn't write them fully uppercase. Personally, I prefer the Java convention because enums feel like constants to me, so I prefer to have them fully uppercase. All right, so next we have events and event handlers. And this one is one that I wasn't sure how to name for quite a long time. So hopefully this section will be useful to you, if you were like me at least. Events refer to some action. They should be named using verbs or verb phrases. For example, downloaded, loaded, deleted, added, damaged, moved, things like that, okay? They should use present tense for events that are raised before the action starts. For example, a close event that's raised before the window closes should be named closing, okay, present tense verb. And they should use past tense for things that have already completed. For example, closed. Okay, now for the rest of the name, you can use whatever makes sense to you, right? Like same as any variable, think what will the next programmer understand and things like that. And just quickly about casing, again, what programming language are you using, right? Use the standard casing for that. Next, event handler functions and methods, all right? So with those, there are a couple of different conventions. In front end, you tend to prefix the name with the word handle, okay? And then the name of the event. Some examples are handle user subscribed or handle file downloaded. In C#, it recommends using the name event handler at the end of the function. The method. So for example, you would have something like user subscribed event handler or file downloaded event handler, okay? And of course, in other conventions, you might just have handler at the end or whatever else it is, okay? Now, my personal preference is to use the handle as a prefix because it keeps the method or the function a verb, okay? So like handle user subscribed is a verb, whereas user subscribed handler is not a verb, okay? So that's why that's my preference. And then another interesting one is on functions, okay? So you might have seen them on some code. Functions like on area changed or on click, on user subscribed. things like that, okay? What are those about? So in general, well, at least in C#, those are methods that exist to raise an event, so to speak. So hopefully you can see some code on the screen there. You have them in case like your class is going to be extended, subclassed, right? And then you want some other method to call the parents method for actually firing the event. Something like that, okay? And then on the front end, it's done slightly differently, at least in React. It's like the props for attaching your event handler function to the DOM. Okay, so hopefully you can see some code with that. And we also use it for the name of props we accept. And the usage of it in your React components, the functions you create to handle the events, you prefix them with handle. That's the convention as far as I'm aware. And inside those functions, you might also call an on function that you accepted from a parent, okay? So your handler functions are called handle, and other handler functions that you get from somewhere else, they're called on something, okay? Something like that. I hope that makes sense. And more than that, there are different kinds of events other than just these, right? You also have PubSub, or you might have heard of it as message bus. And you also have analytics and things like that, right? Like Google, you go to something like Google Analytics, like it will show you some event names that have happened. So how do you name those? The thing with those is that those are a lot more global than local events in your code, okay? Something like PubSub can span the entire application, and something like Analytics not only spans the entire application, but it could be many different websites for your company that you have one account for. It can span multiple applications. So with those, you need to be a lot more specific to understand what the heck is going on, okay? And one way to do that is to basically use prefixes and namespaces. Okay, so some examples you can see on the screen. Like for PubSub, you might prefix the kind of thing that you're working on and then followed by what you did. So for example, you might have UI theme changed, or player damaged, or user registering. And that's important, as we just said, because PubSub covers so much of the code base that you won't know what the event refers to if it doesn't have the appropriate namespaces, okay? And for something like Analytics, similar thing. So, a blog post by David Wells that I've got on the slides there recommends a convention like the following. What the application is, so to speak, with what was affected, and then what happened to the thing that was affected. Okay, so again, it makes large scopes like that easier to work with. Now, the separator, right, that you use to separate namespaces and stuff can be whatever you want. It doesn't matter, you just pick one and you use it throughout your code base, okay? How many namespaces you have, you can decide, whatever works best for you. And what those namespaces are, you can decide as well. Yeah, I hope all of this makes sense, right? All right, next we have file names. And there are quite a few different conventions for file names depending on your programming language, your framework, and things like that. So let's go through a few of them, then you can decide which one is most appropriate for you. So one of the most popular naming conventions are to write file names either in kebab case or snake case. So what that means is fully lowercase with either hyphens or underscores to separate the words. In many programming languages, this is the convention, and that includes HTML. In particular, in HTML, you tend to use hyphens because, at least in older servers, the name of the file, right, the name of your HTML file may actually show up in the URL, and underscores are extremely uncommon in URLs. So, kebab case in this case. In CSS, you also find this convention with either hyphens or underscores. In Python, right, Page recommends lowercase with underscores only. And the Google JavaScript style guides recommends again, the same convention, either underscores or hyphens. Now, as for which do you use between hyphens and underscores, it seems to be either. Either are fine, recommended by many conventions. In general, if I'm using this convention, I prefer to use hyphens because it reflects the code I write more accurately, right? Like in CSS, the convention is to use kebab case, not snake case. In HTML, the convention is to use, again, kebab case, not snake case. So for that reason, I tend to name my files with kebab case. Other conventions that exist, though, are for C# and Java. The convention is to name your file the same as the main thing that you wrote in your file. So in most cases, that's a class, right? Or an interface or an enum or whatever. So you use Pascal case for your file name and you name it the same thing. And the same happens in React. Your React component, which will be named using Pascal case, you name your file the same thing. And that includes your JavaScript file where you define your component. It also includes your CSS file. So as we said, a few different conventions. Now, which one should you choose? Firstly, of course, choose the one that's like the natural choice for your language or framework, okay? So if you use C# or Java or something, they already recommend the convention, use that one. If you don't use React, right, probably use the most common convention, which is kebab case or snake case. If you use React, use the React recommendation. But if you don't have one that you must use, right, then which one should you choose out of your own initiative? So my thoughts on this are that I like using the convention that best reflects my code, okay? So you can see that in HTML and CSS, if you use kebab case, that reflects how you write your HTML and CSS because you also use kebab case for those. In C# and Java, using Pascal case, you also use Pascal case for your classes, interfaces, and so on. So it's the same. So, if there isn't a set convention, that's what I recommend. Go with the one that best reflects your code. Okay, so what do you actually name your file? Because those file names can be pretty tricky to come up with, all right? So in general, what most conventions would say is you need to name your file after its purpose, okay? So many times that means after the main thing that you define in your file. And that is supported, for example, with the Java and the C# naming conventions. Okay, so with those files, sometimes the file name must be the same as the class you define in that file, depending on your framework and stuff. Otherwise, it won't work. So obviously, that's what you do, and that is the convention. Okay, but it gets a little bit more tricky if we're looking at a language like JavaScript. The Airbnb style guide, which is one of the most popular for JavaScript, also recommends the same thing, okay? So it recommends to name your file after your default export. So yet again, it means the same as the class you define in your file or the main function you define in your file. It's the same thing, but it doesn't always work, okay? So here are a few cases where it won't work. And one is if your default export is something like a function called main or setup. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to name your file main or setup, especially since other files may be exporting a function named the same thing. So, you're not going to have files named the same everywhere in your code base. So what do you do in this case? Again, you need to consider what is the purpose of the file. For example, if you have a file that has code about a carousel, okay, and you export the function that's going to set up the events on the DOM or something like that, the purpose of the file is the carousel, right? So in that case, I would personally name the file carousel. Now, there are a few alternatives to this. You can rename the function that you export as carousel, but to me, it doesn't make as much sense, right? Because you're setting up the events for the carousel. So you may not want to do that. But yeah, that's another alternative. Rename your default export and then name the file the same as your default export. But another thing to consider, and this is the one that I go by, is if you were writing classes instead of functions, okay, how you would probably do it is you would have a class named carousel, and the setup for the carousel would be in the constructor. So again, in that case, I would think, how would I do it the object-oriented programming way and name my file after that, if that makes sense. Another possibility is that, say you have a file that has some utility functions in there or something, like for example, some functions that you use in your tests or something like that, and you don't default export any of them because they're all of equal importance, right? None of them is more special than the others, so that you would default export that one. Again, in that case, what do? You choose, right? You can consider the purpose of your file, which in this case would be testing utilities, so that's what I would name it. Or you can consider how would you write the code if you were using classes. And the answer to that one is you would probably have a class named something like test utilities, and then every function would instead be a static method, right? So yeah, I hope that helps. So finally, we have package names and namespaces, and this is the final section of the things we'll cover. So what do? Well, first of all, in practice, because like package repositories aren't usually like audited, basically anything goes, okay? Like, yes, there are conventions, but as far as I'm aware, no one has to follow the convention, and they can literally upload whatever the heck they want, okay? Having said that, it's good to follow the conventions, and here are some of them that you can use. Now, if you're using Maven, which is the Java package repository, right? The format is like you have a group ID that comes first, and that's a reverse domain name generally. So like if your website is programmingduck.com, the group ID would be com.programmingduck, okay, like the reverse domain name. And then the artifact ID is like what you call the thing. And like, for example, Spring or Spring IO, or whatever the packages in Spring are, the general convention I've seen for that is lowercase with hyphens to separate the words. Okay, so kebab case basically. With NPM, which is the Node Package Manager, you don't tend to have as many prefixes. Like with Java, you can have a lot. But with Node Package Manager, you just use kebab case again. And you may have a prefix at the start, like a company name. So some examples are React, React DOM, right, without a prefix. And another example is at Babel / like that's the prefix, and then Babel has many different packages, like at Babel / core, at Babel / whatever, and so on. And with NuGet, which is the package repository for .NET, just like with Maven, you can have many prefixes, many namespaces, whatever you want. And you'll find, right, first of all, they use Pascal case. These ones is the convention. And you'll find some without any namespaces, like for example, mock, which is a very popular mocking framework, okay? You'll also find some that have just one namespace. So AWS SDK .core and .whatever, okay? And then you also have others that have many, many namespaces. Like for example, Microsoft .extensions, .file providers, .abstractions, okay? So basically Pascal case with as many namespaces as you feel like you want, okay? And while we're on the topic, namespaces, which you use in object-oriented programming languages, tend to follow the same structure as the package names. All right, so that's the end of the section. You made it, congratulations. It was quite a long video. Just before we go, I do have some final tips for you if you're still interested, and those are: remember that naming is hard, okay? I'm sure you've heard of this quote already, but there are only two hard things in computer science, and those are casting, validation, and naming things. By Phil Carlton said that. So naming is hard, but spending the time to come up with a good name is usually worth it, okay? Having said that, you need to be pragmatic. You can't spend 3 hours coming up with a good name, right? You just spend maybe up to a couple of minutes. And if you still haven't come up with anything good, you just use the best you've come up with and you move on, or you ask a colleague or something, right? Be pragmatic, you still have work to do. On another note about being pragmatic, we mentioned that you want to avoid the variable named user list, right? But these guidelines are here to help you. They're not here to be the law of what you do. So if sometimes you feel like a variable like that would be useful, then make a variable like that, Do what you think is best for your code base. And finally, the most important point of this video is for you to understand the motivation and the principles behind good names, okay? So that's that the next person to read the code should find it easy to understand and things like that. And now you've seen a few of the general conventions so that hopefully you can always make good names that will be easy to understand. All right, so basically that's it. That's it for the video. It was quite long. Congratulations for making it through. If you've encountered any names that you think are really bad in code you've worked with, then please let us know in the comments. And you know the drill. If you like this video, then please leave a like. If you want to see more videos about clean code and programming principles and things like that in the future, then please subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you want to discuss anything, leave a comment. If there was anything wrong, leave a comment, things like that. All right, thanks very much and see you next time.